Mrs. Harper was indeed a respected figure in Harpersville, but she had a flaw. She was dismissive of anything that didn't align with her perspective. She entered the high school classroom briskly, her heels echoing sharply against the floor. The room fell silent except for one student engrossed in his book at the back of the room. "Joshua Bennett," she called out in a stern voice. Her eyes flashed as she summoned him to the board. Josh looked up, startled. He quietly closed his dinosaur book and walked to the front, eyes on the floor. "This isn't a reading room. It's a math class," she said, her voice echoing around the room. The rest of the class watched the spectacle unfold. "Your flights of fancy won't get you anywhere in life. It's time you started reading something realistic. Math, science." She turned to the class, signaling her son, Thomas Harper, sitting at the front. "Now, take an example from Thomas here," she said, praising her son, who was an exceptional math student. "He is grounded in reality, not in fictional tales of beasts that don't exist anymore." Thomas blushed, looking as uncomfortable with the praise as Josh was with the scolding. Despite being a part of Harper family, Thomas shared more similarities with Josh than with his mother. He too was a dreamer but was forced to mask his true self under his mother's critical eye. The room filled with an uncomfortable silence after Mrs. Harper's declaration. Josh returned to his seat, his face red but his spirit undeterred. He held onto his dinosaur book tighter, his love for stories and fantasy worlds unchanged. Mrs. Harper's voice resonated through the classroom once again. "Joshua Bennett, back to the board, and bring your book with you," she ordered. The words hung in the air like a chilling winter breeze. Josh, clutching his dinosaur book, walked to the board again, his face a mixture of fear and defiance. Mrs. Harper continued her lecture, her words designed to belittle and humiliate. She seemed to take satisfaction in this act, a smirk playing on her lips. "Daydreaming will get you nowhere," she scoffed, her voice echoing in the pin-drop silent room. "You'll end up being a janitor, or if you're lucky, maybe a driver. That's because you ignore the lessons that truly matter." Turning to the rest of the class, she pointed towards her son, Thomas. "You all should aspire to be more like Thomas. He's probably end up in New York, trading stocks and living in the American dream." The praise for her son was as lavish as the humiliation she subjected Josh to, widening the divide between them. With a final look of disdain, she grabbed Josh's book from his hands and threw it into the trash bin. The sound of the book hitting the bottom of the bin reverberated through the room, eliciting a gasp from the students. Josh stood frozen, tears welling up in his eyes. The book was more than just a tale of dinosaurs. It held a clue he was about to unravel, a key to a world that seemed much more engaging than the reality he was forced to endure. Mrs. Harper dismissed Josh with a wave of her hand, and he returned to his seat, the sting of her words still fresh in his mind. The lesson continued, but Josh was barely present. His thoughts were on the discarded book, his heart aching at the loss. After class, when the room was empty and silent, he retrieved his book from the trash. Holding it too close to his chest, he walked home. The day's events etched deeply in his memory. When Josh came home from school, his eyes red from crying and the dinosaur book clutched tightly to his chest, he found solace in his mother. She was a simple seamstress named Sarah Bennett, known for her kind heart and quiet strength. Seeing her son so distraught, she gently patted the seat next to her, inviting him to share what had transpired. As Josh relayed the day's humiliating incident, Sarah listened, her heart aching for her son. When he finished, she took a deep breath, her eyes welling up with tears, but she held them back, knowing that she had to be strong for her son. "Joshua," she began softly, "don't ever let anyone dim your light, not even your teacher." She touched the dinosaur book lightly, a gentle smile crossing her lips. "These books, your dreams, they are a part of who you are, and they are important Maybe you should continue reading them in secret, but never stop." Her voice was steady and reassuring, instilling a sense of belief. "Don't give up your dreams just because someone else doesn't understand them. One day, they will be the reason you will shine." The morning sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Thomas approached Josh in the schoolyard. His mother's actions from the day before had left him mortified and embarrassed. I want to say sorry," he said, stuttering slightly, "for what my mother did. It wasn't right." Josh nodded, appreciating Thomas's gesture, but feeling the sting of yesterday's humiliation nonetheless. Thomas then asked about the dinosaur book, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. He had always secretly admired Josh's imagination, and if he didn't have the courage to embrace it himself. "Can I borrow the book?" he asked hesitantly. Josh hesitated before responding. "I returned it to the library." But in reality, he had hidden it, fearing further humiliation or the book being taken away from him. Over the next few years, both boys followed vastly different paths. Josh moved to Texas for college, focusing on chemistry. He had chosen a practical field, though he never lost his love for stories and imagination. After his graduation, he found a job in the oil industry. His insightful understanding of the industry's needs soon led him to start his own consulting company, providing valuable services to large petrol corporations. Thomas, on the other hand, found himself in Chicago, studying finance at a prestigious university. His life, still under the watchful control of his mother, was all about facts, figures, and following in her footsteps. He struggled with the pressure, always feeling a pull towards the fantastical world Josh had once tried to share with him. The 10-year reunion had the entire class of Harpersville High back within the school's familiar walls. Everything was seemingly the same, yet everything had changed. Thomas Harper, now a successful financial analyst in New York, was the talk of the town. Mrs. Harper, visibly glowing with pride, basked the admiration bestowed upon her son. Josh Bennett was there too, his presence mostly unnoticed amidst the chatter about career successes and adult lives. He remained as humble as ever, choosing to keep his achievements to himself. To the townsfolk and his classmates, it seemed like he was still lost in his world of dreams. Mrs. Harper, even the disdainful figure, greeted Josh with her usual coldness. "Still living with your imaginary friends, Joshua?" she asked, her words laced with mockery. The others around her chuckled, failing to see the cruelty behind her words. "And look at Thomas," she continued, motioning towards her successful son. "If you ever need help, you should ask him, okay? After all, he's living in the real world, not in the page of a dinosaur book." Her tone dripped with sarcasm, causing another ripple of laughter around the room. Despite the veiled insult, Josh remained silent. He had always been resilient, facing the world with an unruffled calmness that seemed to be his armor against Mrs. Harper's barbed words. As the reunion party dwindled down and most people had left, Thomas found himself drawn towards Josh. Just like the old times at school, slightly tipsy from the drinks, Thomas dropped the mask he had been wearing all evening. "I hate it, Thomas blurted out, his eyes not meeting Josh's. The financial world, the numbers, my mother. I've been trying to please her with my whole life." Josh, ever the good listener, didn't interrupt him, merely nodding in understanding. The honesty that flowed from Thomas was surprising, but it revealed a side of him that had always been hidden under the weight of his mother's expectation. Feeling a bit emboldened by Thomas's confession, Josh decided to share some of his own life. "I am about to start an archaeological company," he confessed, his voice brimming with excitement. "We will be unearthing real dinosaur skeletons up in the north." Thomas looked at him, surprise etched on his face. "Dinosaurs?" he echoed, a hint of admiration in his voice. It was as though he was seeing a glimpse of the world Josh had always tried to show him, a world of imagination, adventure, and the pursuit of passion. Within a few months, Josh launched his new company specializing in archaeological studies, Bennett Archaeology. He was driven by a deep-seated passion and curiosity about the ancient world, particularly dinosaurs. His existing consulting firm continued to prosper. Through his innovative thinking and management skills, he was able to build an automated system that efficiently managed operations. The company grew, with over 5,000 to 6,000 employees working under his leadership. Despite the considerable wealth he amassed in a short span of time, Josh found his true happiness lay not in his financial success, but in his new venture into archaeology. His childhood dreams of dinosaurs and ancient mysteries were now a reality. Every site visit, every discovery, every unearthed dinosaur bone brought an unmatchable joy to his life. It was a joy derived from living his passion, a joy of making his own path, something that numbers on a bank account could never compare to. Josh's life took an unexpected turn when his archaeological company made a groundbreaking discovery. Amidst the millions of years-old fossils, they found remnants of prehistoric microorganisms. This revelation led to a significant advancement in the field of immunology, and they were able to construct a novel immune response methodology based on the ancient defenses these organisms used. The new methodology proved revolutionary in combating modern viruses like influenza, hepatitis, and RSV. This breakthrough projected Josh and Bennett archaeology into the international limelight. Major news networks across the globe was abuzz with the young entrepreneur's success story, making him one of the most talked about and envied figures of the time. Coincidentally, these significant accomplishments came just around the 20th anniversary of Josh's high school graduation. The daydreamer who had been written off by many, who had been mocked for his love for dinosaurs, had now become a renowned figure in scientific and entrepreneurial circles. The upcoming school reunion held a new significance for Josh. He was no longer just a humble daydreaming boy from Harpersville, but a successful entrepreneur and a pioneering figure in the field of archaeology and immunology. Despite the momentous occasion, Josh chose not to attend the 20th anniversary in his high school graduation. He feared his overwhelming success might cast a shadow over his classmates' achievements and accomplishments. His innate humility and consideration for others led him to skip the event entirely, a decision that surprised but also garnered respect from many. Over the next decade, Josh's success only amplified, and his reputation as a successful businessman and savvy investor became well known. He became a respected figure in global business circles, yet he never lost his connection to his roots. As the 30th reunion of his high school graduation approached, Josh decided it was time to revisit his old school and classmates. The reunion was a quiet and peaceful affair. Mrs. Harper was also among the attendees, her once dominating presence now softened by age and the crutches that supported her. Her health had degraded over the years, and she could no longer drive herself. After the event, Josh, ever the gentleman, offered to drive her home. As they navigated the familiar streets of Harpersville, the silence in the car was broken by Mrs. Harper's raspy voice. "I have done some thinking," she started, her voice shaky. "I regret being so controlling. I regret the way I treated you and Thomas and everyone else." Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She turned to face Josh, her gaze filled with remorse. "I am sorry, Joshua. Truly, I am," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. In that moment, the stern, controlling Mrs. Harper was replaced by a remorseful, vulnerable woman seeking forgiveness. Josh listened to Mrs. Harper's apology, and without uttering a word, he offered a reassuring smile. His silence was not one of the resentment, but of understanding and forgiveness. As they pulled up to Mrs. Harper's home, he spoke for the first time since they had started the drive. "Everything will be okay, Mrs. Harper," he assured her gently. The mention of Thomas, who had been noticeably absent from the reunion, prompted a new question. "I didn't see Thomas today. How is he doing?" Mrs. Harper, visibly struggling to hold back her emotions, began a heart-wrenching tale of Thomas's struggles. Thomas, once the apple of his mother's eye and the pride of Harpersville, had been living a life of isolation and despair for the past 3 years. After being fired from his company, his behavior had taken a turn for the worse, and he had shut himself off from the world, including Mrs. Harper. He had refused to find a new job, and it fell on Mrs. Harper to take care of his bills. Her words were laced with guilt and regret as she sobbed, blaming herself for the unhappy man Thomas had become. Josh listened to her story, his heart heavy with empathy. The contrast between his and Thomas's lives was stark, and he couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if they both had been allowed to follow their passions freely. "I'm not asking for help, Josh," Mrs. Harper interjected, her voice wavering in emotion. I'm not in position to do that. I needed to get this off my chest." She took a deep, shuddering breath before continuing. "All these years, I thought I was doing the best for my son. But I realize now, it was never about Thomas. It was about me, my dreams, not his." Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she confessed her regrets. "I pushed him into a world of finance, a world he never belonged in. He made good money, yes, but at what cost? He's not happy. He's alone." Her words echoed in the silence of the car, heavy with the weight of remorse and lost opportunities. Mrs. Harper, the woman who had once been the epitome of control and ambition, was now a mother of grappling with the harsh reality of her actions. Josh, sitting silently beside her, absorbed her words, deeply moved by her heartfelt confession. It was a moment that embodied the adage that success at the expense of happiness is, in fact, the greatest failure. As Mrs. Harper's painful realizations unfolded, the true cost of denying one's passions became more apparent. Josh took down Thomas's address from Mrs. Harper and left her with a reassuring smile. Over the week, he rallied a few of their old classmates, all of whom were concerned about Thomas. They decided to pay him a visit and see if they could help him out of his isolated state. To their relief, Thomas responded positively to their visit and agreed to join Josh in his archaeological pursuits. Although it was a far cry from the world of finance he was familiar with, the change seemed to breathe new life into Thomas. He took to the work with an enthusiasm that none of them had seen in him for a long time. A few months later, Josh paid a visit to Mrs. Harper. This time, he had a surprise for her. He took her with him on a trip to one of the archaeological sites where his team was currently working. When they arrived, he pointed out Thomas, who was working alongside others with a newfound vigor. Mrs. Harper watched in disbelief and then relief as she saw her son looking genuinely happy for the first time in years. It was a stark contrast from the isolated and unhappy man she had described only a few months ago. Josh's simple act of kindness and understanding had managed to steer Thomas towards a path of healing and self-discovery. The sight served as a poignant reminder that it's never too late to change course and follow one's passion. Thomas stood, his clothing dirty from the excavation work. His jeans were smeared with mud and dust, and his shirt was dotted with sweat stains from the hard work under the sun. His hands were gloved, caked with the grime of excavation site, holding onto a brush used for meticulously uncovering buried treasures. His face bore the brunt of the outdoor work as well, streaked with the mud and dust. A layer of grime seemed to have permanently settled in the lines of his forehead and the curve of his cheeks. Yet despite the outward filth, his face held an inexplicable glow. His eyes sparkled with a vibrant energy that had been missing for years. The despair and loneliness had vanished, replaced by radiant shine reflecting genuine happiness and contentment. It was as if the very dirt and grime he was immersed in had revealed the true Thomas, a man brimming with life, zest, and curiosity. Thomas spotted his mother and Josh and walked over to them. his steps confident and cheerful. This, he gestured around the side, and a broad grin on his face, is where I belong. I have never been happier. His words hung in the air, a testament to his transformation. Here, amidst the dirt, Thomas had found his true calling. The world of finance and numbers was behind him. Now he was part of a world that was rooted in the earth, in history, and intangible discoveries, a world that truly resonated with him.